Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein, and our guest today is the author of books, short stories, plays, film and Broadway theater criticism for The New Yorker. He is also the ultimate urban activist. Can you not hear me? Brendan Gill is or has been the chairman of the board and guiding spirit of the Institute for Art and Urban Resources, the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and the Municipal Art Society. He is a member of the New York City Cultural Affairs Commission and has had long-term involvement with the Morgan Library, the Victorian Society, the Film Society of Lincoln Center, among others. A very special and a warm welcome to you, Brendan. In the lengthy introduction that I gave obviously reveals that you've had many voluntary commitments, but only one job during your entire career. Can you tell us the circumstances of that employment, and how does such a curious and restless fellow like yourself come to stay in one place for so long a time?
Well, for one thing, of course, I never had to get a job because I began, when I got out of college, selling short stories to the New Yorker. And then they asked me to come and join the staff. And from that moment on, that was the only place I wanted to be. And it isn't quite as confined a career as it sounds, simply because on the New Yorker it's possible to do a great many different jobs. So in effect, my life has been broken up over a period of 42 years into many different tasks, all of them agreeable. And in extreme old age, I hope they'll find me something new to do. Nobody should go on being a drama critic at my age. It's a scandal.
You were a film critic?
I was a film critic. It would be scandalous to be a film critic at my age, too.
Why do you say that?
I think I'd be better off pretty soon being told that I can only write obituaries.
No. What about
that day
the
may
corpus?
come and I will welcome it.
The corpus of one's experience and judgment and expertise, doesn't that figure into it?
It's nothing like as important as the fact that young playwrights shouldn't be judged by old farts. It's just a terrible thing. And one of my colleagues within the last 2 years had reached a point where not only could he not any longer find his seat in the theater, he couldn't find the aisle, and then just before he retired, he couldn't find the theater. Now, this man was passing judgment on young playwrights in their 30s and 40s. He was also passing judgment on black playwrights, and he didn't like blacks. You know, the prejudices and bigotries of age are ineradicable, and worse by far than the bigotries of youth, which are also ineradicable. But in neither case are they to be encouraged. And also, besides that, the historic fact is that all drama critics have done their best work in their early 30s, including Ken Tynan and Birbal and Shaw and anybody else you want to name.
But you didn't become a drama critic until you were, I guess, past 50.
In the 50s, absolutely. It shows how perverse the New Yorker is.
What jobs have you held at the New Yorker in addition to being film and drama critic?
Well, of course, I've written short stories there and poems, and I have written many hundreds of talk of the town stories, many scores of profiles and reporters at large, scores and scores of book reviews. They're all different kinds of occupations, and they're all pleasurable. The only thing I never could bear to be, and I tried that too, was to be an editor, because that is selfless, and I am not selfless. And I couldn't stand it when I would have made somebody else's work sufficiently good to have it reach print, and for me not to get the credit. And there are other kinds of people, very saintly to my eyes, who don't want credit, who just like to help make other people do their best work. This is wonderful, but so unlike me.
It's not true. You said that most of those activities are very pleasurable. Can you share with us some of them that are also memorable?
No, I wouldn't think that that it was a memorable life. It's a curious thing. I wrote a book about the New Yorker a couple of years ago, and I said that I had no history because I had such a happy time and had done so little work. And then I went on, however, for 400 pages.
You're referring to here at the New Yorker.
And writers are always doing that. They are always saying on page one.
But in a sense, that was an anniversary.
It was the 50th anniversary of the New Yorker.
Celebration in many ways, but I'm talking about in your own personal experience. There must have been a film, there must have been a play, there must have been a profile that stands out in the long sweep of memory more than others. Can you recount some of them for us?
Among the people that I've written about that I admire and still admire very much, it was great fun doing a profile of Georges Simenon, for example, who was then living in this country and was unknown in this country, and it was pleasurable to me to help make him known in this country. And it happened that I wrote that profile simply because this absolutely perfect piece of property came on the market up in Norfolk, Connecticut, where we have our country place, and the price of that camp on the lake was identical to what was paid for a profile in the New Yorker. So I went up and spent the weekend with George, and I've always been known as the fastest gun in the East, and I came back and wrote the profile in a week and got the money and bought the camp. And then I had the pleasure of having George and his family come over and say, "Look, George, what you made possible in perpetuity, that 1 week's work could lead to the possession, as I hope, of this wonderful camp for the next 100 years by my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren."
Well, you probably are the fastest pen in the East. The work pours forth with uninterrupted regularity. You were referring to here at the New Yorker last year, Summer Places, this really beautiful volume that does, I think, so much better than anything of its kind has ever tried to do, both in text and in photographs.
Yes, this is largely the handiwork of a wonderful Canadian photographer named Dudley Whitney, who did a celebrated book on barns a few years ago that, to everybody's astonishment, sold 100,000 copies. Nobody knew that all over America and Canada people were mad for barns. And so Dudley and I have a very great sympathetic interest in 19th century architecture, and we had a marvelous time going around visiting houses all over the United States and Canada, and staying, of course, in many cases with the nicest people who had the biggest houses and treated us in this splendid fashion. So we thought afterward what we should have done was to have told the publishers that this work was impossible to do in one
summer.
year, that we should have had 5 summers.
What about Winter Places?
And
soon to
we would
follow?
love it. If somebody said, "Now don't you want to do Winter Places?" we would say yes.
However, in Summer Places, there's a wonderful quote, and it goes something like, "Summer places, you say, are where memories are made most vividly, where life is most intense." And the opening lines of that are really quite lyrical. You say, "Summer places, to me the words are among the most haunting in the language. The sound of their mingled syllables seems to hint that something exceptionally pleasurable is about to happen."
I think there is almost a mysterious connection between summer and childhood, and everybody that I ever ask this question of seems, like me, to have more memories of summer than of all the other seasons put together in childhood, that the awakening of summer and the awakening of life in childhood are somehow linked. And I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of separate memories of the first 5 years of my life in summer, but I don't have an equivalent number of memories of what ought to have been, because of school and other things, an equally important time to me. But we get closer to nature, of course, in summer, where our bodies become more alive, are naked, or are freer to the sun and to the wind. And
so then the same thing would obtain in winter in tropical climates. It's climate that you're talking about.
You would think so. It should be that case.
Or if not, your Winter Places will be a very slim volume.
My chief memory of winter is that of having mittens which had strings going all the way up here and all the way down here, and the laboriousness of that kind of thing, and putting on Arctics, things like that.
How does a resort become popular? How does a resort become popular? Is it an invention, or is it spontaneous generation?
In the earliest days, the Indians had summer resorts, hard as it is for us to believe. For example, at Flat Rock, North Carolina, was the chief meeting ground of the Indian tribes, and the Iroquois came all the way down from New York State to spend the summer in Flat Rock in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And when the white men arrived in the 17th century, the Indians very kindly showed them the mineral springs, which were sacred to them, had magical force, and the white man characteristically accepted the springs as their own and kicked the Indians off the property and took over. And so the first summer resorts grew up around mineral springs. And then soon it wasn't enough to take the vile-tasting waters or to bathe in them. And gambling hells were built nearby, and big hotels, and it became a social place. So Saratoga, for example, began with health and ended with racing and gambling. And similarly in the White Sulphur Springs and Warm Springs and Hot Springs and all the other springs.
Well, obviously, not only do tastes change, so does our culture. Yesterday's gilded playgrounds that you talk about in some great and interesting detail are often today's commuter suburbs. What are the most enduring summer places?
Oh, Newport by far, because it was a summer resort for Southerners. And people from Charleston used to come up by boat, often in their own boats, because there were merchant princes in Charleston very early. And they came up and took their families up north to Newport to spend the summer away from malaria, away from yellow fever, away from all those diseases, and away, of course, from the terrible climate. And there was Newport, marvelous 18th century summer resort, as well as a town on its own merits. And then in the 19th century, it became fashionable for New Yorkers. And in the 20th century, contrary to what most people think, it remains fashionable. And there's more money than ever in Newport. And big houses are still run with scores of servants, with a footman behind every place at a 24-seat sit-down dinner. The rich keep getting richer and richer. They're a little bit more ashamed of showing it. In the 19th century, there was no point in being rich unless you could be conspicuous. And in the 20th century, after the Depression, people got to feel differently about conspicuous display. So while the rich get very much richer and the disparity between rich and poor increases in our system of social injustice from one decade to the next, nevertheless, the rich lie low, except in Newport. And there they're not ashamed because they've been doing it for 200 years.
And where are they the most modest? Maine?
No, it doesn't take much money to be rich in Maine. I was thinking, you know, there are people building houses now in East Hampton, for example, that cost over $1 million. But they look like such simple little houses. And it's wonderful to me that you can't get much of a house for less than $1 million on the standard that satisfies the rich.
What's your own special favorite place?
Well,
Other
where
than
I go in
home.
summer, of course. Norfolk, Connecticut is where we always have always gone. And that's because it was my wife's family's place. I'd always gone to the sea as a little boy. And this is one of those racking decisions made in the course of marriage. Whether the wife goes to where the husband is always gone, or whether the husband goes to where the wife is always gone. And since the property that she had fallen into disuse, it challenged my ingenuity to bring it back, and so I did.
You mentioned that Indians were among the first inventors, so to speak, of summer places. In more modern times, how did summer places come into existence? You make the very interesting point that in a mere handful of generations, men went from fearing solitude to seeking it. That obviously is intricately intertwined with larger issues. Can you talk to that for a moment?
Yeah, what was eagerly sought in the 19th century, especially after Emerson and the whole transcendental thing, was a conviction which Emerson had borrowed from previous people, including Rousseau and others, that there was something in nature which was imminently good. And man, if he was fortunate, could seek out in nature that imminent good, which was not to be discovered certainly in cities, which were evidently corrupt and brought out the worst in man. And so very early on, Emerson, among others, was oft in the Adirondacks. And Whitman, of course, disciple, proto-son of Emerson, was striking out on the open road as early as possible. And he sought everywhere, or seemed to find everywhere, that goodness in nature, which I, for one, would argue, of course, doesn't exist at all. But it's nice that they thought so. And then we got great work out of their conviction that there was some good out there that didn't exist other than there.
Somehow one doesn't think of you as an outdoors person.
I'm outdoors, but I don't respect it. I'm a city person. All civilization, as Lewis Mumford has said in his book, City and History, all civilization is in and of the city. There isn't anything. There's no way to sustain life intellectually or spiritually or emotionally except in the city. And even the people who live in the country and suppose themselves to be gaining nourishment from the country gain it in effect through the contributions of people in cities who make even the apprehension of the natural possible through words. For centuries, people labored over the Alps, and not one single person ever wrote about the Alps as being beautiful. They weren't beautiful. They were just a goddamn nuisance. And then Petrarch came along and other people came along, and by the 18th century, the thickest clod of a young English gentleman catching his first view of Mont Blanc burst into tears. That's what you can do with culture. But it shows that there isn't anything there, or that everything is there. You can take either side.
You're best known, and it's quite obvious with your eloquence, as a maker of words and ideas. Yet in the recitation of your involvements, there is a preponderance of interest and contribution in terms of the total urban environment, in terms of architecture and design. How did that ever come about? What prompted such a deep interest in preservation and conservation?
Well, architecture was my first interest. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I was already making blueprints in my bathtub at home, and I always was fascinated by architecture. And I'm now doing a book on Stanford White. Well, Stanford White was familiar to me when I was 7 or 8 because my father used to point out a certain house in Hartford that he said had been designed by Stanford White. Like all the other attributions very nearly that existed, it was not by Stanford White at all, but I had that name fixed well in my head as a child. And all my life long I was interested in architecture, and if you're interested in architecture, you're interested in all periods of architecture. You become increasingly Catholic, and so you become increasingly eager to preserve as many specimens of as many styles and periods as you can. So that led, obviously, to preservation, and so here I am.
If you were so interested in architecture, why didn't you become an architect?
I didn't like these courses that you had to take in college in order to get to architectural school. I hated mathematics. I hated things like that. Now I like them, but at the time I hated them. In fact, one year at prep school on doing my college boards, I got the lowest grade in geometry of anybody in the United States. And my math teacher at the school at first had been so chagrined with me and he was disappointed in me, but when I at last achieved a superlative, and he realized that in his class was the person who got the lowest grade. It was almost like having the highest. And he became proud of me. He looked askance at me, but with pride.
Henry James, whom you admire for so many reasons, you've also described as one of the most astute of architecture critics. Why didn't you become, early on, a critic of architecture?
Well, I suppose I was, you could see that I was preoccupied with it. My first novel was called The Trouble of One House. And
a prize-winning novel at that.
A house has always meant something extremely emotional to me, and all my metaphors, all my images, all my figures of speech tend to be linked to houses and rooms and corridors and that kind of thing. And I have gradually over the years acquired, I think, enough knowledge to become a critic, a good architectural critic. But James was a travel writer who was passing judgment, and he wrote many books of travel in which architectural criticism was a natural function of the writing. And I never had to do that, or didn't do that until quite late. And I will be doing that, of course, a lot in the Stanford White book.
And do you envision in the evolution of your own career doing more and more of that for the New Yorker?
No, I would like to do about 2 more factual books, and then I would like to go back to fiction. And because you lose your wits in regard to fiction very, very early. Very, 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 very few writers have been able to write fiction in age. There's something goes out of you, and one knows perfectly damn well what it is that goes out, but it fails. And it happens in the arts, but it happens painfully with writers. Thomas Mann was an exception. There are 1 or 2 exceptions in every generation.
Well, the book that many of us are eagerly looking forward to is the Stanford White book. When can we expect that?
That won't be till
And
about...
what is its focus? And what is its
Well,
focus?
it'll be a social history as much as anything, as well as a biography, because White was an interesting man in that he came at a time when the rich in America had gotten very rich and were still under the domination of the tiresome WASP Protestant work imperative. And they didn't have a good time. They had money, but nothing to do with it. And he paganized the plutocracy. He got them to enjoy themselves. He let them relax. And he staged wonderful parties for them. And he filled their houses with plants, with greenery, with roses, with everything growing. He wanted light and growing things and joy. And these were all very foreign to 19th century millionaires who had spent their lives having people killed and money grubbing and teaching in Baptist Sunday schools.
How about to 20th century young Americans living in Connecticut? I can recall your once telling me that the single most recurring and absorbing figure in your own work in life and imagination was Stanford White. Is that accurate, and is that still true?
Well, I identify very strongly with him because he's my ideal of what a human being should be. I would like to imitate him in everything except his death. I haven't been murdered yet. And I wouldn't like to be murdered.
Well, what is the standard to which you aspire that he reflected? Perhaps you can unfold his life a little more fully for us.
Well, to toot my own horn, for the purposes of history, by far the nicest thing that was ever said about me was said about me in a letter that Mary Ann Moore wrote me once, which I had totally forgotten, and it was published in a little booklet of the Mary Ann Moore thing at the Rosenbach. And she wrote me in a letter, which I've long since lost, that I engendered an insatiable appetite for life in other people. And that's what
That is a
Stanford
very
White.
apt description.
But that's what I would like to have on my gravestone. But the thing is that they don't have gravestones anymore. and because you have to be able to mow the plot without interruption.
Except in Paris at Père Lachaise.
Yes, but then nobody's going to carry me all the way over there. I'll be lucky if they bother to put me in the ground wherever I fall.
It's hardly the case.
Mary Ann and I were great friends because she was full of life. And she pretended to be very shy, and she was exceedingly robust.
You have written and published poetry over an extended period of time. Do you still do that?
Oh, yes. My greatest dream is to get a poem in the New Yorker. That happens once every few years. I was terribly pleased. Somebody sent me yesterday, I think I must have it in my pocket. I'm carrying it around everywhere. I noticed from a book catalog that my first little book of poems published when I was at Yale, this copy was for sale for $85. And it said it has a nice 10-line inscription by Gill. And I have no idea, to whom I gave that, and 10 lines is quite long. March 1936, a blank.
If 10 lines absorbed that reader, I can recall several years ago when 5 lines that would rhyme, absorbed you. And I'm thinking about your special book about Cole Porter. Can you tell us the circumstances of that encounter? Did you know Cole Porter?
No, he was of a different generation from mine, so he was just halfway between my father's time and my time. And I perhaps wouldn't have known him anyway, although I knew scores of people who did. But naturally, I was always interested in him, and he was a contemporary to the degree to which, when I was an undergraduate in Haven, Red Hot and Blue came to town with Fred Astaire, and Ethel Merman came to town, and all these people came to town trying out at the Schubert Theater. So Porter was very much in my life. And when the publishers asked if I would do a book on him with Robert Kimball, I was delighted to do so.
He was the curator of the Porter
He was the curator
Archive.
of the Cole, at that time, of the Cole Porter Archive at Yale. Cole died childless, as you would expect, and left a lot of money and a lot of his archive to Yale.
Perhaps you would clarify my 5-line rhyme reference.
I was afraid you'd ask for it, and I was then afraid I might fail to get it. Flying high in the sky with a guy is my idea of nothing at all. And the way it breaks up on the page, it's five rhymes in a row. It's wonderful.
Did you ever know Tallulah Bankhead, the subject of another book?
I only met her in passing once during the war, and again, it was the book about Tallulah grew out of the fact that we had done a book on Cole, and my editor and I thought, well, who else in the United States was also always known by one name? And of course, that was Tallulah.
You could have ended up with Hildegard.
Yeah, there were lots of others, Bricktop, all the other people.
Mm-hmm.
I always have the first sentence of a book ready long before I have anything else in the book, and our youngest son, who was then very, very young, when I said, Charles, I already have the first sentence for Tallulah. And Charles looked up at me with his big blue eyes and said, what is that? And I said, she was a strange one and no mistake. And Charles said, are you sure that's good English?
Is that the first line in the book? It remained, in spite of that. You said you'd like to do 2 more factual books. I assume one of them is the Stanford White book.
Yeah, and then I want a book of essays called 30s People, which will embrace some of the people I've already written about, like Philip Barry and others, but also will be about Frank Lloyd Wright and other people that I knew in the 30s when I was young. And I would like it to be a paperback for use in colleges and places like that, just as a background reading series of essays.
Who were some of the other persons?
Well, I want to do both the Roosevelts, Eleanor and Franklin. He was the first person I ever voted for president, and I encountered him a little bit, and I encountered her more, and I'd like to set down my thoughts on them. And there would be about probably 20 essays altogether, quite brief, and it would be of some documentary value. As you grow older, you become more and more autobiographical, and you become increasingly a liar.
And I was saying the other day about FDR that when I was in a position to know him, a friend of one of the family asked if I'd like to come to the White House and have drinks with FDR at his desk. And I said, oh, I'm not going to bother him. Oh, no, my God. But my memory is reconstructing that now. And,
Did you have drinks with him?
I'm getting closer and closer. Now I'm in the outer office, and I can look in the room, and I can see him mixing the drink. And in about another year, I'm going to be seated right next to him. And he's going to be saying, Brendan, name your poison. So never trust anybody's memories, but because the act of memory is a continuous reconstruction, patting everything into shape.
It's an interesting thing for you to say, because you have repeatedly said that you don't keep any memos. But
I do
it
everything
is
from
legendary how architectural in appearance your office is, and what I'm talking about are the pyramids of paper. So it seems to me that every time I think of those towering pyramids, the range of experiences, the range of people in and out of your life, that there must be something that you're keeping, even if you're not cataloging it. It also seems to me that it's not really possible that someone with your sense of history, let alone your sense of preservation, is either disregarding or destroying the past.
I know, I feel bad about it, but I'm incapable of being orderly. And it's like me to have lost the letters of Mary Ann Moore's, and I've lost scores of letters like that. I'm incapable of keeping them. I should. John Updike I think is going to be somebody whose letters should be saved, and yet I haven't saved his to me when he's written.
But you may not be quite certain, because I keep on hoping that, like an archaeological tell, that
There's a
one
lot
digs
there.
in there.
But
Are you
no, I
really
lead a
not keeping
disorderly
records
life.
of these, just the 42 years at the New Yorker, let alone the range of cultural institutions that you're either a founding father or a perpetrator of?
It's all in my head, and then it'll be increasingly, as I say, unreliable. I couldn't get over the fact that my father in old age said of us children, there were 5 of us, and we had given him the most terrible life. Oh, he was a widower, and we were at each other's throats with knives, and frightful lives. And he was miserable because of what we did. And in his old age, he said, you were all such good children, such good children. And I wanted to shake him and say, no, no, you've just lost your own life. And his memory, he had completely blotted out the horror of his life. I mean not to blot out anything. I haven't had much horror, but I hope to keep it as clear as possible and get it down before it's gone. And that's why I say we are increasingly autobiographical in anything we write.
Well, why don't we, at least for the moment, and I hope for history, take an inventory of a rather hefty slice of New York City's cultural life by just reviewing some of your involvements. Can you tell us, can you describe for us the purpose, the program, the nature, the motivation of some of the groups and your involvement with them? Why don't we tick some of them off, and why don't we start with...
We should start, really, to be proper, if you like, with the Municipal Art Society, because the other organizations have been spun off, that
Please.
mother body, which is 85, as you know, Barbara Lee is on our board. It's an 85-year-old organization which was founded by Richard Hunt and other distinguished citizens in order to seek the embellishment of New York, which was notoriously a city devoted to money grubbing and was much less beautiful than any other city in the United States that it ought to have been comparable to. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, they were all proud. New York wasn't proud. It had nothing except money. So these people wanted to embellish New York. It soon turned out that we had to fight other causes all the time because New York was being destroyed even without embellishment. So we have become a kind of watchdog of urban amenity in New York City, and most of our good things are things which victories we have won which leave no trace because we have prevented some horror from taking place rather than
For example, the Grand Central.
So again and again we have spun off bodies which will help to save New York. The Committee to Save Grand Central was spun off the Municipal Art Society. The Landmarks Conservancy, which I have the honor to be the chairman of, and which probably is also on the board of, was spun off in order to do a particular job of being able to hold property, of seeking out and cherishing and protecting certain landmarks. The Institute for Art and Urban Resources,
They know all about
Alana
that.
Heiss was here. That was spun off from the Municipal Art Society because Alana had come back from London, as you know, with this knowledge, and we wanted that body to be in a position to do what it wanted to do separate from the mother organization.
Well, that's one conglomerate. But there are whole other areas. For example, You are the vice president, as I recall, of the Film Society of Lincoln Center. How did your involvement with that body take place?
That came out of my having been a film critic, or a film reviewer, movie reviewer. And,
how do you distinguish between film reviewer and film critic?
Well, I think well, I always make the distinction that the reviewer is doing an ephemeral journalistic task, and that the chief function of that task is to give the reader some sense of what a given movie or play or book is like. And if the reader is familiar with the reviewer and can take his crotchets into consideration, the reader will then say, yes, I'd like to see that play or that movie or that book, read that book. A critic addresses himself to the work, whether the work is hateful, whether it's hateful to the person, and addresses himself also to the maker of the work. And if the maker of the work happens to be alive, that may be a useful function that he forms. But criticism is largely that which appears in quarterlies and annuals or in books, and reviewing is very ephemeral and should be very ephemeral. And I think that everything in the New Yorker tends to increase to the point of criticism and to go away from reviewing. When we gave up having an ordinary art reviewer or reviewing the galleries, saying what was in the galleries, we had Harold Rosenberg. Well, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to issue wonderful pronunciamentos on the nature of art in our time, and we had to be grateful for that. But that was no longer an ephemeral activity. And Pauline Kael tends now to do the same thing. She wants to write criticism and not to be a reviewer.
What do you think of the state of both criticism and reviewing of the arts in this country at this point in time?
Well, it's famously nothing like as good to my mind, and I think I say famously because to most people's minds as it is in England. And certainly the people who do the reviewing of the theater are not a very starry group of people. The number of people I admire most, I suppose, are the film reviewers, because they are livelier, more alert, more interesting, and more interested in their subject. There are an awful lot of time servers in the world of play reviewing. It was famously the job you got if you couldn't do anything else on a paper. If you couldn't even cover a fire, they'd let you cover the theater. Curious.
What can we do to elevate, improve the whole level of criticism? There really is a
Well, you
dearth
kill
of...
the old first. It's called euthanasia, I think. I know a woman who, they've changed the name of it now, but she used to have to be the person who gave benefits to raise money for the Euthanasia Society. And imagine going to the theater on a euthanasia benefit, and imagine the actors on stage thinking that the house out there was all full of old people arguing in favor of euthanasia. Oh. But in any event, that avoids a total answer.
Are there the work of any critics who are currently at work in this country whose ideas and style you most respond to?
Well, among my contemporaries, I like, actually, as journalism, the work of Jack Kroll in Newsweek as well as anybody, because he's able to practice that form of journalism as well as anybody can. It was like Jim Agee. He does it just very well indeed. But I think what you do is the next generation of people coming along, all the young people, everyone wants to be a film critic nowadays or to write books about film. So obviously there are going to be tens of thousands of very disciplined and learned young people taking over.
Except I sometimes wonder, in an electronic age, where with one broadcast, one really does reach an audience that perhaps, what was that figure with Swan Lake? More people saw the one broadcast from Lincoln Center than during the entire course of history that Swan Lake was performed. So one assumes that more and more people might be interested in electronic criticism, except there is either very little room for them within that medium, or an escalating of the level of that criticism in terms of trendiness, punchline, impact.
The networks
Really,
don't want that.
Yes.
The networks rob us blind. Our airwaves don't belong to us. They belong to 2 or 3 thieving corporations. And they're perfectly content to pretend that they're doing good by giving some nonentity 2 minutes on the air to talk about a play or a book. And if they get a good man like Leonard Harris, who was a good man, a serious man, attempting to do a good job, they throw him off the air. No, the record of the broadcasters of the networks is disgusting. And we don't even know whether
prognosis
anybody...
there? And your prognosis? Maybe it's an
Oh,
idea
they
whose
don't
time has
want it.
come.
No, they don't want it. They wouldn't sell a nickel's worth of anything for them. So they've nothing to gain. They're doing their job exactly right, which is stealing up from us and giving us the rottenest stuff that they can get away with. So from their point of view, perfection. You have to congratulate them. It's like a bigot who hates everybody equally except himself. There's something wonderful about it.
Do you see any major difference between the public broadcasting stations and the commercial ones? Or
Yes, there's a difference, but they bungle their assignment too. The arts in New York City, the greatest city on earth, culturally the leading city of the whole world. And what does Channel 13 do about the arts in New York City? Almost nothing. They've thrown us one sop in 10 years that I know about, and that's Skyline, which has a very small
about
budget.
to be off the air, too, from what I
And
gather.
John O'Connor was protesting that this morning in the Times.
Yes.
No, the public television is a scandal. Nobody would ever guess in the year 2000 anything if they had to rely simply upon the cassettes of TV programs and on public or private, that we had any cultural life in New York City, that we were not only that we had any, but that we were the leaders of the world. No record of it will exist. The only advantage of television is that it causes people to read books. Wonderful. We know that. It's a great inducer of reading.
Which is a wonderful transition.
And a great surprise.
For my introducing the subject of your involvement with the Morgan Library. You were, as I recall, the chairman of the Fellows of the Morgan Library and still have an active involvement with that group. Tell us about the Morgan Library, and is it available to wider numbers of people? If some of the people in this class or in the audience would be interested in involving themselves, how is that done?
You have to write to the library and in effect, offer your credentials as a student, as a teacher, as somebody engaged in writing a book or doing whatever you're doing. And then judgment is passed upon the validity of your credentials at that point, and you're given a card and you go to work. Eileen Ward, that wonderful woman, is doing a great, big, thick book on Blake. Well, the Morgan Library has greatest Blakes, and so she's there all the time working away at that. And it's a tiny institution, with the result that they do have to limit the people who come in there, and it's always accused of being elitist. There's no possible way to let more than a handful of people in at a time. You couldn't even let the public in very large numbers if the public chose to come.
Well, you're saying in some ways it's comparable to the special and restricted collections of the public library that should be available only to scholars or credentialized persons.
Well, imagine you can't even touch those things.
Yes. You're also, I think, the vice president of the Victorian Society.
This is getting to be more and more like a premature obituary.
No, it's a catalog.
I hope it's premature.
Oh.
I feel absolutely great.
You look great. You sound pretty good, too.
There may be a bus out there with my number on it.
Cut it out, Brendan.
But we'll all remember it if that's the case. At least you'll all remember it if that's the case. That he was joking about it on that very platform that night.
The Victorian Society.
And he seemed so full of fun and happy. And the next thing
Please, spare me.
the Victorian Society was founded here on 11th Street in the kitchen of Margot Gale's apartment, where so many good things have been founded. I don't know how good a cook she is, but she's a wonderful founder of organizations there. And out of meetings came this need, at that time radical, to do something about preserving the best of the 19th century in architecture and the decorative arts. And we began as a very small group of half a dozen people, and now we have 6,000 members from coast to coast. We'll soon have 20,000 members. That is truly an idea whose time has come. The 19th century is not only a time that we recognize as being infinitely the greatest architectural period we ever had, much greater than the 18th century, of course, and greater so far than the 20th, and the 20th is nearly over, but also that it was in the greatest jeopardy of any period. People hadn't learned, hadn't been told, hadn't been educated.
Too familiar. Too much like grandmothers?
Yeah, and so they were knocking things down. They still do. Every day, 365 days in the year, we lose some wonderful Victorian building because nobody told them in that given city, in that given place, that this was a precious building. And if they learn that, then they do save it. They become proud of it. People get turned around overnight that way.
How do you explain the fact that preservation and restoration and conservation and recycling have become such a popular issue so quickly?
I think partly it's the fact that we are more preoccupied with history than we were famous in the past, Henry Ford's statement, "History is bunk," represented the best thinking on that subject of the 19th century. You know, they didn't look back. And now, and in fact, they were, in some reasons, they felt ashamed of looking back. Now we are preoccupied with looking back, but I think it's a healthy preoccupation because, as Santayana famously said, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it.
And what do you see the future direction of preservation?
And certainly in New York City, for example, we will never do what we always did in the past, which is knock it down every 30 years and build it up again. And we will now, from now on, thanks in part to the energy crisis, in part to other things, we will be continuously reweaving the fabric, the new with the old. And it will be a much stronger fabric and a much more rich and nourishing city to live in than it's ever been before. It's a thrilling challenge to young architects, and they are leaping to that challenge.
And they are being re-educated to that vocabulary and that challenge.
They never knew that this was going to happen. Philip Johnson, who was the opposite kind of person, who loved building new things, and he was talking last year, and he said, "You know, I've never remodeled a building in my life." And somebody in the audience shouted, "What about Avery Fisher Hall?" He said, "My God, I didn't realize that. Even he is remodeling things."
In a speech during the course of the last year, you articulated a theory about the nature of buildings, and that, as I recall, when they are long about 70 years old, what happens to them? Can you recount that little theory?
That's a wonderful thing that I really believe in, although it began as a kind of toy of an idea. There's a wonderful man named Douglas Gordon in Baltimore, and who loves the past and loves architecture, has done much to save Baltimore from mistakes. And he, looking around, realized that there was something that could perhaps be described in mathematical terms, and he calls it the Gordon curve. And the Gordon curve says that a building is at its maximum moment of approbation when it's brand new, and then it steadily goes downhill, downhill, down here, until at 70 it reaches the bottom, the very nadir of disapprobation. And if you can get a building past that tricky moment at 70, then the curve begins to go up very rapidly again until it's back where it was in the year one.
I suspect the same theory may hold true for humans.
If we could get back, but whoever got back.
Well, the long.
But the Custom House, for example, is just about like that. We're very proud of the Custom House now. We wouldn't have been 20 years ago. And you can make this test in New York City or any town you live in. You'll find that the 100-year-old building is much more likely to be safe, and the 70-year-old building is the one that's likely to be knocked down.
The Custom House Institute is another subsidiary of the New York Landmarks Conservancy. In an attempt to save that building and to draw attention to it, an exhibition of photographs was held initially, and several subsequent art and photographic and now American Indian artifact exhibitions held in that wonderful hall. To commemorate that initial occasion, as the chairman of the Landmarks Conservancy, you prepared an essay for a slim and widely distributed volume on the Custom House. One of the things that you comment on is the Daniel Chester French enormous limestone sculptures of the 4 continents that are mounted on this extraordinary building. You raise the question in that essay without answering it, in a sense bringing together several fields that interest you, and the question went something like, does anyone know what Henry James thought of statues that sit instead of stand? What is the reply to that question?
That was based on something which I ought to mention first, which is that Henry James wonderfully said that everything else being equal, a building that sits is more pleasing than a building that stands. And once you hear that, you spend the rest of your life looking at buildings, deciding that building sits, that building stands.
Now,
the Morgan
what
Library
is the
sits,
the
public library
versus
sits,
stands?
and obviously the Chrysler Building not only stands, it leaps. All buildings can be divided pretty much that way.
Except say the Villard House and the Palace Hotel, which will sit and stand.
Well, yes, we put the two together, it'll be that way. And the Gothic leaps and the Basilica really sits. I mean, the Gothic cathedral leaps and the Basilica, the Greek Basilica or the Roman Basilica sits. But
and which
Henry
is your
James,
preference, those that sit or those that stand?
There is more repose in the ones that sit. I think for the
But how
long
about
term,
grace?
I would rather look at a house, a long house. We can have a house that not only sits, it lies down. because extremely sensual, because we have the technology to do it. But Henry James, I was posing the question in fun because I don't know that Henry James ever did decide anything about statuary and whether that ought to be sitting or standing.
And Brendan Gill, has he decided?
I like lying.
I was saying reclining figures are probably his specialty.
A reclining figure in the landscape.
When you talk about a house that sits rather than stands, it brought to mind something you mentioned earlier, and that was your early involvement with Frank Lloyd Wright. And I can also recall your once having said that during your own Frank Lloyd Wright period, you redesigned your Norfolk, Connecticut house. What was your involvement with Frank Lloyd Wright, and do you really think of yourself as a designing man?
Oh yes, and I was recently elected an honorary architect, by the local chapter of the AIA, and that makes me very proud. It means that I can do nothing that I couldn't do before I was elected. Absolutely meaningless and attractive honor, and I accepted it with joy. But I had always, I came to know Frank Lloyd Wright when he was coming to town first many years ago in connection with the first drawings and preparation of plans for the Guggenheim. And James Johnson Sweeney was the director of the Guggenheim and the one who commissioned Wright to build it. And I was a friend of Jim Sweeney, as I am to this day. And so he introduced me to Wright, and Wright and I became fast friends. And whenever he came to town, he would call me at the New Yorker and say, "Hello, Brendan, this is Frank." And I was young and he was old, and I worshipped him. And I felt no more ready, really, in my heart to say, "Hello, Frank," than as if George Washington had telephoned me, and I would have had to say, "Hello, George." But, of course, Frank, as old men do, wanted to be called Frank by young people. So we were friends on that basis, and then we always saw each other. And then I stayed with him out at Taliesin in Wisconsin, one of the most wonderful, long, low-lying houses in America. And we always had great fun together. And I remember at a dinner party once I was expatiating on my then theory, which I still largely hold, that all the great men in our time have had to have a very large measure of the charlatan in them. And Frank said it immediately. He was then 85 or 6. Brendan,
you say 85 or 6 because he fibbed about his age.
Yes, he also, yes. And he said, "Brendan, do you think I'm a charlatan?" And I skidded past that as fast as I could at dinner. And then afterward, we were walking up and down, and he, like all people, have to justify the degree of charlatanism in their lives. And he said, "I couldn't have got my work done without it," which is perfectly true. He couldn't have. He designed very little that got built until he was 60. Comparatively little between the age of 30 and 60. And he was a glorious charlatan, in part. And so was FDR, and so was Picasso, and so were 20 people, Hemingway, all kinds of people. And I would think that would be something that I would be dealing with in my essays on 30s people. The fact that even as early as that, the media was turning us into charlatans. And
Is
we're
it
all
a charlatan or a
now.
public posture that one must assume?
Well, that's what I think.
What does that mean?
A mountebank, a clown. You have to be vivid in order not to be ignored. And this was beginning even in the 30s, you see, and maybe it began before that, but it certainly was vivid to me in the 30s as something which I couldn't stand. I hated the fact that my hero, FDR, was also a liar and a cheat and a clown from time to time. I didn't want him to be that.
To the works of what public figures, be they in the arts or architecture or politics, do you most respond now? Are you most admiring of, given human frailty?
I would say that a great man, Elliot Carter, for example, who is now elderly, has led an absolutely beautiful life.
About to celebrate his 80th birthday.
75. Has written beautiful music, has been modest, has never been a show-off, never been a clown, never been a charlatan. To my mind, that's...
Do you think his work has suffered as a result?
Not a bit.
Well, excuse me, not his work, the public response to his
No,
work.
I think his music is sufficiently difficult so that it wouldn't have had a large public
audience
response
anyway.
So he would have been wasting his time if he had been a mountebank. But he hadn't been. He was a good man. These things, of course, have to depend upon other aspects of good fortune, like having money enough to live. Frank Wright, and I would have said it myself, that part of one's charlatanism is an attempt to keep afloat financially. Some people have independent means and therefore have the responsibility to behave better than the rest of us.
Are there any architects at work currently who you think, either currently or in the long sweep of history, contribution will be marked with the significance that you give to either the 19th century Richardsons or to
Well, I think our friends,
Stanford White?
Hardy, Holtzman, Pfeffer, have a good chance of leaving some work behind. They will stand up. And they will be leaving work behind also, which won't be acts of personal arrogance, but will be part of this weaving of a fabric. They're among the brilliant young people who are prepared to take an old building and treat it with respect, as they did with Cooper Hewitt, for example, the Carnegie Mansion, and as they've done with music halls and everything all over the country. They respect the past, and they are sympathetic to the past, and they work with the past, and they produce works of art that are successful in the present. And I'm filled with admiration for them, because they're exceedingly gifted people.
I think so too, as you know. By general account, I assume one numbers the work of Mr. Johnson, Mr. Pei, and Mr. Barnes very high on any list. How do you respond to their work individually?
Well, I think that I.M. Pei's East Wing, which you'll be hearing about next week from Carter Brown, is an authentic masterpiece. It is a folly you can only call it a folly. It's a splendid folly. It's a beautiful folly. And
why do you call it a folly? Because of its scale, its expense?
It's absurdly large for what it does. It didn't need to be as big as that. It didn't need to do any of the wonderful things that it does. And that's often the sign of great architecture. That's what Van Burrow was doing when he did Blenheim. That was what any of the great architectural works in Rome built under the popes. They were making statements that were indefensible in terms of logic.
So
the Farnese Palace, who needed that? But I think it was wonderful that Paul Mellon, who was a true devotee of architecture, would have given Louis Kahn a chance to do his Center of British Studies in New Haven, immaculate piece of work, and then let I.M. Pei build a building that cost $120 million. And every single stone...
I thought it was 93.5. That was bad enough.
Just polished. Everything is fitted into place. Everything is cut on a bias. The extra work that was done.
Well, they patented a special device, I think, called a spiring gasket. It was the first time that the marble facing one piece would articulate into another.
But it's
and the work of Mr. Johnson?
Yes, he also is an admiration of mine because he's a close friend, and so that's all bound up with my friendship. But I've always admired his fact that he has been experimental, that he has moved from style to style, from effort to effort, and he's been very uneven. And one of the first times that I came close to him was when he designed some dormitories at Sarah Lawrence. And I said, I saw the blueprints from Harold Taylor, the then president of Sarah Lawrence, and I said, this is the ugliest thing I've ever seen, and it won't work. Harold, being the kind of person Harold is, absolutely honest, picked up the phone, said to the secretary, get me Philip Johnson. He said, Philip,
Brendan
Gill,
says.
and he says, this is one of the ugliest things he's ever seen, and I want to send him in, and I want you to show him models and everything else. And Philip said, send him along. So we went in, and we had a debate about the building, and Philip I said, it looks, like the worst of industrial architecture of the 19th century. And he said, yes, aren't those buildings wonderful? Don't you love those windows? And he went on and on like this. Now he would agree with me about those dormitories, but that was a phase he was going through, coming back to windowness, instead of just having all glass at that time. He wanted to go back to a wall penetrated by windows, pierced by windows, and this was a first fumbling attempt at something which he developed afterward in a different way.
Was the building ever built in terms of the original design?
Mm-hmm. It looks just the way he designed it, unfortunately. My argument had no effect on him, needless to say, and neither would anybody's argument with anything that Philip wants to do. He's wonderful. He's a spellbinder. All great architects are great spellbinders. And it's a function of architecture to be a spellbinder.
Well, perhaps because it's ultimately a fantasy profession.
Maybe. Frank Lloyd Wright was beyond anything in getting clients so excited they were hopping up and down about something which he had designed for another place, and he'd persuade them that they were building it just for them there.
Where was that? What building?
That was the famous Bartlesville, the Price Tower in Bartlesville, and Mr. Price was an immigrant who had invented a way of threading pipes for gas lines, and he made an immense fortune, and he had a little two-story red brick building in Bartlesville, and he needed about another little red brick building, but his children were proud, and they said, Daddy, you ought to get a great architect to design you a great building. They put a call into Taliesin in Wisconsin. Frank answered the phone, of course, at once. He was out of work. He had nothing to do. He not only didn't say, I might consider it, he got on the next train. He was down in Bartlesville as fast as he could get there. And he said, I want to build you a tower. I want it to be like a tree that is strayed from the forest. I want it to be a needle in the desert. And he went on like this. And Mr. Price said, no, you haven't done this. This is the most wonderful thing you'd ever heard. So he said, yes, build it. They didn't know for years that it was a design that he had made for St. Mark's in the Bowery down here on 2nd Avenue, and in the 1920s. And the Depression had come, the crash came, and he never built it. And there is that building. In the last place on earth it ought to be Bartlesville. Mr. Price couldn't rent any of the upper stories for 15 years, but he was proud. He liked it.
Brendan, you're also a member of the New York City Cultural Affairs Commission. It's only several years old, and you have been a member since its inception. In the short time that it's been in existence, what has it been able to accomplish, and what is its purpose and what are its goals?
Well, its real purpose is advisory, as you know, being a fellow member, and it is not an official body of the city government, as the cultural commissioner, Henry Gelsaler, is. He has a department. He is built into the city system, thank goodness. Unfortunately, he is built into the system with a very tiny budget. It was when the cultural activities were taken away from the Parks Department, where they had been put by chance over a series of things that you're also familiar with, that the new department began. And when Martin Siegel, who was the person behind all this, wanted to get it through in the reorganization of the city government, he didn't dare have the budget be bigger than the budget had been when it was in the Parks Department. So we knew that the budget was too small from the beginning, but we got the department started. We now have a distinguished man, Henry Gelsaler, as our commissioner. It is his task to try to get more money from many sources, both city and private. And the commission is advisory to Henry Gelsaler. It is also a link between the official department and the citizenry of New York. We represent a great many interested bodies of all kinds all the way across
Does
the
it
board.
make a difference, do you think?
It hasn't made much difference yet, and it would be disappointing if it didn't make more difference in the future. We won't make any difference unless more money is available. It is always, again, a question of what you're capable of doing. And it would be foolish to belong to such a body if it were only going to be some kind of self-satisfaction or window dressing for the administration. And neither of those things, I think, is going to happen.
What are your greatest frustrations in that role?
Money. You can't do anything. New York City gives less to the arts probably than any city of any size, if you figure the statistics, on earth. And it's only recently, through Marty Siegel and others, that we discovered how valuable to the economic life of New York the cultural life of New York is. And from now on, armed with that information, we ought to be able to get a great deal more money out of the city government. And I think that Ed Koch, when he gets past one or two of the present financial problems and sees some kind of clear sailing ahead, and he's always talking about a renaissance of the city, then we'll say to him, Ed, put up or shut up. And he's very good about it. I think he will put up.
I think so, too. You've written on so many diverse subjects on a weekly basis, in journals, in magazines, in books, poetry, short stories, a prize-winning novel. You've been everywhere. You've met everyone.
I've never been anywhere. That's the only drawback to my life. I've never been to Greece. I've never been to Israel. I've never been to Egypt. Shocking.
Well, you've certainly been everywhere in this continent.
Yes, I keep crisscrossing this.
And not only do you keep crisscrossing it, you crisscross it on a nightly basis. If you ever want to know what is happening any place, Brendan was there.
I love seeing all the different cities of America. That really is a thrilling aspect of my life, to
How
be able to do
do you
that.
get time to write?
That's
When
also,
do you do that? You
That's a
commute?
mystery even to me.
Really? How do you do
Usually
that?
I go to parties every night, 2 or 3 parties every night. So it makes it difficult to get any work done then. But I don't sleep. As you grow older, it's true what they used to tell you in extreme youth. You don't need to sleep as much and you don't need to eat as much. So I can live on 3 or 4 hours of sleep. And I always get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, no matter how weird the night before has been, and leap to my desk.
I started to say you've been everywhere, I'm in that. You know everyone, I won't amend that. You've done most everything, and that I'll let you reply to. Do you have any plans in writing what is genuinely a memoir?
Well, no, I think it'll become by accident.
A 5-foot shelf?
Well, it would be, again, you know how things are with writers. If a publisher came along and said to me, we would like your memoirs and we would pay you this amount of money, and if it was a sufficient amount of money, I would do it. If it wasn't, I wouldn't. Because as Sean, the editor of the New Yorker, once said about A.J. Liebling, was protesting that he wasn't earning enough money. And Sean, for once, was driven to distraction by this continuous complaint on Liebling's part, which was a justified one, by the way. And so Sean, to the extent that he's capable of losing his temper, said, Liebling wants to live like a stockbroker, but he doesn't want to be a stockbroker. And that's the way I am. I want to live like a stockbroker, but I don't want to be a stockbroker. And the result is that much of my life and much of my career will be dictated by the degree to which people are prepared to finance my own personal follies.
If you had it to do all over again, would you do anything otherwise?
Of course, but then I wouldn't be who I am now. So one never regrets anything that one has done. One only regrets what one hasn't done. And when I was a very young man, I decided I was going to judge everything from the aspect of my 70th year. And I would think, what if at 70, looking back, and some young girl when I was in my 20s had held out her arms to me and I had refused to leap into them? Oh, how angry I would be at 70. So I've always thought that way.
Kitty Hart says that the only
It has
thing
made
that...
it possible to do anything.
Kitty Hart says that the only thing that Moss Hart ever regretted was all the things that he never bought. That's not one of your follies.
Well, Uncle Arthur Knox, a famous figure in my life, always said if you see anything you want, you must buy it, because otherwise you'll spend the rest of your life regretting it. And if you do buy it, you'll always find the money somehow.